So here we have our main shaft, and I just want to show you that it's actually got three holes in it. Two at the bottom, these are where the main gears are, and one at the top for our rotor head, and then it's got the pinch collar here as well. So basically it needs to be inserted into the machine with the two holes first, and then the one hole sticking out the top that our rotor head is going to bolt to, and the pinch collar of course sitting above our top main bearing block. Okay, so the main gear is now in, which I'll just show you. Let's bring it round. It's the main gear installed. You can see the screw and nut that goes through there to hold that in place. And I've also set the tension on the belt here by pulling the boom backwards and then clamping up the bolts at the back here to hold the boom in place. And then once that was in, I put the locking collar onto the main shaft here. So you pull up on the main shaft, push down on the locking collar, and then lock it in place so you get no vertical play in the main shaft. And then I took the opportunity to go through and tighten up all the bolts on the frames, which are metal to metal, because none of these have Loctite on, so you need to go and find all the ones that are metal to metal. These ones under here as well, these ones underneath the battery tray, this one here, the bearing blocks, all the ones that go into frame stiffeners, all need Loctite on them, taken out and doing up again. We also need to set the mesh on the motor just yet by undoing these bolts here on either side, setting our mesh correctly, then Loctiting these and doing them up again. I also took the opportunity to work down the boom as well. So all of the various parts on the boom, the horizontal fin, the vertical fin, all the bolts on those have now been done up nice and tight. I also done up the bolts on the push rod guides as well. These things here, done those up and made sure that my push rod is nice and straight down the boom and lines up nicely with the servo horn in the back of the frames for the tail servo. Obviously I said about doing up the boom clamp, which is actually getting hard for me to show you on this camera, but let's get this in here, there we go. This is the boom clamp here, so I've done up the screws on those. There's actually nylock nuts the other side which I can't show you, so I can't manoeuvre the machine around that way. But these have been done up, and the boom is now clamped in place with that belt tension on there. And when you rotate the main gear, rotate the main gear clockwise, the tail rotor is going anti-clockwise, so that's all working correctly as well. Just a quarter turn on the belt obviously to achieve that. So a lot of stuff done, but really just mainly tightening screws up and setting into place stuff that we'd already done. And the main gear is now in there nice. So the next thing really is for me to set the mesh, which is just getting a little bit of backlash in this gear by undoing these bolts here at the front. Undo these bolts, set your mesh so you've got a little bit of backlash. In fact, mine's already correct, it's about right. I've got a little tiny bit of backlash in there. That's already right, so I'll just take these bolts out and Loctite them back in again. And then we're on to putting the rotor head on and building up the rotor head. Okay, so the next thing we're working on is our rotor head. Do make sure you take the spindle bolts out of this, clean up the spindle threads and the spindle bolts themselves as they're very, very oily, and then put them back in and Loctite them up. It does say in the instructions as a warning that they've not Loctited them, so you do need to make sure that you do that. Aside from that, we can now start building up our rotor head, putting the arms on here and getting ready to fit this onto our main shaft. Okay, so here you can see I've fitted one of the arms onto the rotor head, and it should move nice and freely. Now, in a bag with a lot of washers in it, you'll find rubber washers, you'll find these little tiny washers, and these go between this and the arm to give it a freedom of movement. And there are several of these, so you basically add as many of these as you need to make sure that that moves nice and freely. Now this one here, it just needed one of these little washers, and I expect I'll probably need the same on the other side. Okay, and then we have both arms installed, and you can see that these are really free. no stiffness to them at all. Exactly what you want for your rotor head. Okay, so in terms of building up the head, that's actually pretty much it. You can now go ahead and install this onto the main shaft. Of course, before we put the head onto the main shaft, we need to put our swash plate on, and they do recommend taking all the balls off and re-Loctiting them and putting them back on again. Although mine did have Loctite on them, it wasn't a particularly strong Loctite, and I wasn't that confident it would hold. So remove all of these and put them back on again, and then that can go onto your main shaft, followed by the rotor head. One thing to be aware of when you install the main shaft is that the main shaft locking collar doesn't go on top of the bearing block. What you have to do is take this top bearing block out and put the locking collar underneath it, and it's got like a little lip on it which goes up against the bearing on the underside of the upper bearing block. So at the moment, and I'm going to really struggle to show you this, I think, my main shaft locking collar is, as you can see, it's down in here. I have to move it around a little bit, I don't know if you can see that in there, but basically you can see it in there, and that needs to be pushed up underneath the upper bearing block. And basically the way you set this up is that there's a little spy hole in the frame here. See it just here. Let's try and bring this in. There we go, little spy hole there. And you basically put your screwdriver through there to get onto the screw that locks the collar in place. You push the collar up against the underside of the bearing and push down on the shaft at the same time, and then lock it in place, and then that holds the whole thing secure. And then you're done and you can put your rotor head on. Okay, so there we have the rotor head installed and connects up to the swash plate. I literally just plonk the swash plate on, put the head on, put the feathering spindle, the Jesus bolt through, clamped up the bolts either side with some Loctite, put the arms down onto my swash plate so they're in place. Then I just swiveled up my anti-rotation slider, which was sort of laying flat here, and put the screws into it, and there we are. It's all in place and ready to go, and it moves beautifully freely. I mean, really nice movement on this. And that's pretty much it as far as the mechanical build is concerned. That's everything you need to do. I mean, the next bits that we've got to do are wiring up an ESC, putting the servo horns on, and connecting the rods to the swash plate, putting our fly bliss system on the back here, possibly. Looks like a good place for it. Getting a receiver into it and getting it all going. I mean, it's really just the radio part of it that's left to do now. So in terms of builds, really easy, really simple. If you weren't videoing it, I estimate it would take you maybe 2 hours at the top to put this together, and very simple indeed. Okay, so as I said, I'd come back and show you how the radio install has been done on the model, and because there isn't really any radio tray space, just a big battery tray at the front of the machine, all the radio gear needs to be stuck to the sides of the machine, which means that it gets a little bit messy. But to just highlight what we've got, I've got a AR9000 Spectrum receiver on the side here, and the satellite goes off and is stuck to a skid on the other side, which you'll see when I turn the machine over. I've got my V-Bar V5 Pro control box at the back here. Then this of course is the tail servo, then a bunch of wires all bundled up because I've routed them all to this side of the machine. This wire coming out here, this goes to a BEC, a 7 amp BEC, which I've stuck under the battery tray at the front, which I'll show you shortly. So if I just turn the machine over, you can see I put some protective piping here as well for where wires are going around the edges of frames, and up here as well, and also through here. So let me just turn the machine over. You can see the other side. Okay, let's just make sure it's in shot nicely. Okay, so this side we've got the speed controller, then I've taped the black wire because there's two wires here. One of them is like a little wire that you touch onto the battery to get rid of the sparking when you connect. I never use them, so I've just taped that up to get it out of the way so it doesn't go into the motor. And that's all that is on this side of the machine, just the speed controller, and it's held on with two cable ties. I've kept the motor orientated as it is because with the wire coming out the side there, it actually acts as a nice little guard to make these battery wires go around the motor rather than touching the side of the motor. Now if I just push the machine back slightly, so we've got the, just bring that in a bit, radio tray, there we go. Well, the battery tray. So this is the battery tray, and I've got the compass supplied straps on there. And this bit you can see under here, this is my BEC that I'm using to power the radio gear, and I'm using a separate battery as well, so a separate battery and BEC rather than running off the main pack voltage. I do have a BEC that I could run off the main pack with, but I actually prefer to use a separate BEC for radio gear. And the only other thing really to show you is at the back. There we go, you can just see it through there. This is the V-bar sensor here, mounted up on the back of the machine on the supplied flat plate. Also we've got the servos in there nicely, and of course set up the rods on those, and again the same for the tail servo at the rear, which I'm going to struggle to show you. Just try and bring that in, there we go. You can see the tail, sorry, not the tail servo, the elevator servo at the rear. And I had to elongate that rod a fair bit as well for the elevator over what was written in the instructions, because the rod length in the instructions is kind of set as if you were centering the servo. So if the servo was like, I probably can't do it because the machine's got the blades in its holder, but if that rod was parallel to the servo, this rod length was correct. But if you then make it level with the other servos for your 0 degrees pitch, you found that the swash plate wasn't level, so I had to elongate that rod a fair bit. Now the other modification that I've done, which I'm also going to struggle to show you, but I'll try and show you here. Okay, you can see this is the anti-rotation slider, and I've had to Dremel out a big hole in that because the servo actually comes up and hits the anti-rotation guide. So I've had to Dremel out that big hole to allow the servo arm to pass through without smashing into the anti-rotation guide and potentially stripping the gears on the servo. And that was quite a big problem. I had to do quite a lot of work, as you can see, to Dremel, because this was all filled in before. So I had to do a lot of work here to Dremel out that big hole. The anti-rotation guide still has integrity. It's all okay to do this, but it's necessary in order to get the throws on the servo that you need for cyclic and collective. Okay, so that's pretty much it in terms of building the machine. The last thing I did was I swapped the tail. Here we go, this is the tail rotor, and I swapped the tail blades for a set of carbon tail blades. And the ones supplied are plastic, yellow plastic, and they're very bendy, and they really wouldn't stand up to the sort of flying that I do. So I've swapped those out for a reasonable set of carbon blades. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Next thing we've got to do is the maiden flight, and that beeping you can hear is actually the final battery being charged and ready to go.